I'm going to hand it off to Greg. Greg is the owner of Greg's Guitar Lessons. But he is also a full-fledged studio engineer, tracker, mixer, masterer. In fact, you can see there that is not a fake backdrop that he is in front of. That is his legit studio, and he has got more than 20 plus years of experience doing this. And what I like about Greg is that he's not only a whiz at the studio. I have heard the magic he can do. I've heard before and afters. But he also is an educator, which is exactly what we want to have when we're presenting something like this at the library. So I'm going to go ahead and mute my screen and my microphone and hand it off to Greg Henkin. Take it away.
Hi.
Thanks, by Nate. The way, your voice.
Oh, yeah.
Would you like to tell the folks why is it that your voice is extra raspy today? I think they'll get it. They'll love this.
Yeah, I specifically brought the Bears to their victory on Saturday from the stadium. I was able to, yeah, thank you very much, Steve. Yeah, I was able to be so loud that I managed to disrupt the Green Bay offense.
And you were there.
Yeah,
you were there for the
it's
moment.
left me a little raspy here. So if I got some tea and we'll make it through. We'll make it through.
I think we can all understand with that reasoning. So,
Nate, a question for you. Can I put a Dropbox link to this PDF in the chat for people now, or do you want to save it for later?
Sure, you can do it now if you'd like, but I also will send it out tomorrow as well. So, but yeah, people might want to bring it up on their screen or whatever. So
yeah, I would encourage folks to do that.
Yeah.
Okay. We rolling?
You're good to go.
Okay, let's do this. This isn't truly an impossible task here. We're going to try and talk about what music mixing is, the tools involved in it, and some very basic examples of how it's done. So very loosely, the idea of mixing is that when an artist or a band records music, the music components, be it guitar, vocals, drums, piano, whatever. Mixing is trying to shape all of those pieces, individual pieces, to almost fit together like puzzle pieces, because unfortunately, they don't. More often than not, the different tones and textures within instrumentation, they kind of have a tug of war, and they're trying to live in essentially what is the same space. So the idea of mixing is to kind of like polish all of the individual pieces to make sure that they can all go together to make a cohesive sound that hopefully makes like some sort of emotional music. So page 1 on this PDF has a great example of the concepts here. So very loosely, it's shaping them all of these different instruments to fit in this different space. It's almost like it's a cave, right? Where you have some things close to the front of the cave, and then you have some things a little further back, and you might hear something a little to the left or a little to the right. And what you're trying to do is create a certain sense of depth, so that way it feels like each instrument has its own individual space, so that way they can all kind of shine. But real quickly, just to understand how we got to this place, the history of recorded music, the first person to ever be recorded, the first sound ever, was Thomas Edison. He had this concept that sound was a series of vibrations and that you could capture it on the right device. So he would speak into the funnel here, and he would have this cylinder made of wax, and he would just crank the machine, and it would record the vibrations onto the wax cylinder, and then he could spin it around and play it back. So the first recording ever is this really dull Thomas Edison going, "Mary had a little lamb whose face was white as snow." Over time, as recording got more complex and it became more of an industry, you got to this place here where, I'm going to use a movie that Nate and I both love, "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?" What you see here with George Clooney and company recording, that is mixing. You have one person who's closer to a microphone, and then you have other people who are further away. So that way it sounds like there is someone who would be the primary performer. And then the secondary performers are further back. You'll see this a lot in bluegrass, where you might have a series of musicians in one microphone and they'll all be playing. And when someone has to take a lead, they'll just lean in a little bit. That's mixing. Um, so uh, it gets a little more complex as the technology increases. So here you have the most important guy in music, in my opinion, Les Paul, Wisconsin's own. He had a band with his wife, Mary Ford, and he hated the idea that he couldn't play all of the parts at one time, the rhythm guitar, the lead guitar, do his vocals, do her vocals. So he basically set up in his kitchen the ability to record his rhythm guitar on one recording device. And then he'd play it back while playing a lead onto a second recording device and play those back and just go back and forth and back and forth. He called it sound on sound recording. So not only did this guy invent the solid body electric guitar, he also invented the primary way that we still record to this day. Most important guy in music. Um, as technology moved through the, 50s, 60s, 70s, it got to the thing that you might associate most with recorded music, and that is this recording console with the faders and the buttons and the mysterious knobs, who knows what they do, and the reel-to-reel magnetic tape. All of this stuff is supremely important because all of our digital things that we use are essentially kind of mimicking the technology that came around in the 60s and 70s. We still do it. Um, in the 80s and 90s, we got to the digital stuff, and digital is important because that's what we're doing. We all use some form of what's called conversion. Our cell phones, when we, if on the unlikely opportunity where you're going to use your phone as a phone itself, you are speaking in the analog domain. You are hearing me right now in the analog domain. My computer is processing that signal, converting it to ones and zeros, sending it through the tubes of the internet. And in theory, it's coming out your computer speakers or your headphones, whatever. And that is converting it back from ones and zeros to analog sound. And that is a very large component of modern recording. And that introduces a concept called the sample rate. So the sample rate is the amount of slices or samples that digital audio can be recorded at per second. So CD quality is 44,100 samples per second of audio. And these days it's up to 192 and climbing. And the larger the sample rate, the larger the file size. But I would say that the good majority of um, the kind of like consumer level recording devices now, 48K are the primary sample rates you see most. And as technology will improve, it'll be easier to use those higher numbers. Okay, moving along. Signal flow. This is how we get our analog sounds into our computer. So this here is a very common look. This is a interface connected usually via USB into a laptop. And basically the microphone here will plug into the interface, which plugs into the computer. And you can plug speakers or headphones into the interface. The interface is the primary component that allows us to um, it is doing the conversion from the analog to digital and vice versa. Um, so it's very important that you have decent conversion when you're listening to music, because if the digital converter doesn't sound very good, it might negatively influence how you will make mixing choices later. Playback. If you're listening on headphones, playback location is less important. If they are noise canceling or over ear closed back headphones, that reduces a lot of the issues that I'm about to talk about. But if you're going to try and use speakers, it's important that you try to have roughly this setup. It's called the sweet spot. And it's basically whatever the distance is between your speakers should be the same distance for your ears. This makes sure that your um, stereo imaging is hopefully accurate. And what I mean by that is hopefully if you want a vocal or a snare drum to be right in the center, but if you have your speakers kind of crooked, center might not be where you think it is. So it's really important to make sure that you have some form of an accurate listening position. Otherwise, it can be negatively impactful. Uh, Additionally, anytime you are dealing with speakers and a room, um, you could run into an issue where the sound coming out of the speakers bounces around in the room and plays tricks on you. So I have a room that's essentially shaped like a box, which is not great. Uh, but I have all of this treatment on the walls, and it's absorbative material, which hopefully minimizes the amount of stuff that's going to bounce back at me. So let's say I have a lot of low end, like a bass guitar or a piano or a cello, um, and it's coming out of the speakers, and then it's hitting the wall and it's bouncing back at me. Suddenly, I might think, man, there's so much sound in here. There's so much low end. So then I turn it down on my computer. And then I'm going to go out to my car and listen to it later. Or I'm going to put in my AirPods and I'll be like, wow, it sounded like there was so much bass. I was just being fooled. Uh, you have to make sure that your listening environment is hopefully relatively balanced so that way it's not playing tricks on you. So that way, all the things that we're about to talk about, you'll have a better um, and hopefully flatter listening experience. So you can use absorption, which is like the panels here, or there are things that are, it's called diffusion. So that way, when the sound hits it, instead of it bouncing right back at you, it kind of disperses in different directions. Um, this is a little bit more about signal flow. And it's relatively convoluted, but it that's essentially what's happening if you are using an interface in a computer and headphones or speakers. Um, okay, so uh, interface levels or gain staging. How much input volume should you be using? Um, the basic idea here is you don't want to be too loud and you don't want to be too quiet. That's kind of it. Um, you can aim for these target numbers, um, but the reality is you don't want to be too loud because if you turn up your interface volume too loudly, it will essentially create some distortion, and you can't undo that. So you don't want to be too loud. Most interfaces will give you some sort of like yellow or red lights to indicate that you've gone too far. Um, on the opposite end of that, you don't want to be too quiet. So if you're going to record like a quiet, like finger picking guitar part, if the volume is too low when you on your interface, when you go to try to mix it later, if you turn up that volume too loud in the computer, what you're doing is you're bringing up all the noises that are around that guitar. So maybe you didn't realize that the air conditioner was on, and you can suddenly hear it when you didn't hear it before. Um, so I usually say if you can record where uh, your DAW or your digital audio workstation, we're going to use Logic here, but Pro Tools, Cubase, whatever, you want to be in that like -18 as your maybe your quietest, and -6 would be your loudest. So 0 being the absolute loudest you could possibly get. You don't want to get close to 0. You're going to live below that. Um, so there's in the PDF here, it just has some very basic numbers to kind of aim for. And then there are some various graphic images that I found for free on Google. Uh, So it's showing you here noise floor. Um, there's some terminology that is not important for now about the difference between digital recording numbers and analog recording numbers, but I just figured I'd throw them in there just to kind of be safe. This black and purple and green graphic is pretty good. Um, for when you're recording, you're trying to, like I said, -15 to -6, that's a good sweet spot. When we're mixing, we're going to get a little louder because we're going to be probably adding compression and EQ, which might increase the level on those tracks. And then mastering uh, is not relevant today because we're talking about mixing. Okay, EQs. Finally, let's get to some stuff. So EQ, this is our carving tool. This is the first component that allows us to shape our sounds. Really, mixing is just volume, right? So it's how loud something is in the mix, but we could pan something. So that could be how loud it is on either speaker, right or left. And EQs are volumes that are built around the frequency range of an instrument that we are adding or subtracting. So I'm going to open up an EQ here. Oh, hopefully. Okay. This is the stock logic EQ. So this is a very standard EQ. Every digital recording software, they all have the same thing. Uh, it might look different, but they all do the same thing. So starting from left to right, this here is what you'd call a low cut or a high pass. Basically, it's a filter that as I drag it over, it's going to be removing all of the low end sound. So if I'm gonna try some drums here. Let's get rid of this. So if I press play on this drum and I start dragging it across, they should be getting thinner and thinner and thinner until all that low end is removed. You have the same thing on the top end. So I can drag this and it just filters all the way down. In electronic music, you'll hear people use this as an effect to like increase the energy of something. You might hear it. That's also how a wah pedal works. It's just moving the EQ spectrum. So next up is a shelf. This allows you to broadly add or subtract volume for a long range. And you can change the shape of it as well. The shape of an EQ is called the Q. Sometimes you'll see it referred to as. So here I'm going to boost all of that top up. So these four things in the middle are all the same. And this is usually a notch filter or a peak filter. So if you notice, all these things at the bottom here have numbers. So 154 is the frequency that I've used this EQ at. So the lowest humans can hear is about 20 hertz down here. The highest humans can hear is about 20 kilohertz. And as we age, we basically have a high cut filter removing our hearing for those top frequencies. That's also how dog whistles work. When you blow a dog whistle, it's usually a frequency above that 20K. So here is an EQ at, I'll put it about 200. So 200 is my frequency, and I could move it around, but I'll double click. 7 dB. This is 7 decibels of gain added. I could also subtract. It doesn't really matter. And then the Q is the shape. So I could do a really wide boost or cut, or I can shrink it up and be more surgical and carve something away if there's a frequency that I don't like. So sometimes what I'll do is something like this. listen for like a frequency I don't like and pull it out. Um, so that's the essentially how we would use EQs. You're trying to correct something. So if it has a resonant tone, you pull it out. If it is lacking something, like maybe the cymbals lack brightness, maybe I want to add some brightness to the drums. Do that. Add some low end. These are really broad moves, and I don't necessarily know that that's exactly what I would do. But that's just as an example. Okay, so on our trusty PDF here, um, I have a graphic that shows roughly where things live on the EQ spectrum. So, and it shows here at the bottom roughly what we would call these areas. So sub bass, that's like the really rumbly stuff. Bass, uh, not to be confused with the bass drum or the bass guitar. This is just the bass of the general sound. They're saying 60 to 200. These are not very specific numbers. It's just kind of a range. You have your mid-range, high mids, and high frequencies. And it's showing you roughly where things live, like what instrument lives there, including where it lives on a piano, which is really valuable. Because sometimes you might hear a sound, like maybe on those drums I hear something that's like really whistly or a resonant frequency that kind of is sticking out to me that might clash with the rest of the song. And it's because it might be a resonant frequency along the pitches of like a piano, essentially. Because every note on a piano is one of these frequencies on your EQ. And sometimes that can be a conflict. So here, if I do this and I put this at 440 and I'm going to boost it and I'll make it a little narrower. There it is. Okay, this is a pitchfork, like an old tuning fork. If I hit this, this is an A. That'll work. I don't know if it's loud enough. That is an A440, meaning the 440 frequency. Uh, when you listen, you can kind of hear it. So knowing roughly where instruments live on your EQ spectrum helps you make informed choices about what you are adding or subtracting when you are mixing. Um, there are other types of EQs. So this is similar, but you'd call this a parametric EQ. And it's basically you have your low frequency. So this is your gain of the low frequency, and you could add or subtract. And then this is where the frequency would be. So I could say 200, turn it up. Or my low mid frequency. This is my gain. This is my specific frequency. So I can say 1.5K, I'm going to crank it. And this is my shape. So this is very narrow. And then let's see here. We'll save questions for afterwards. Uh, and then this is my width. So this is the shape of it. So these two are essentially the same thing, just a different frequency range. This is going from 200 all the way to 2.5K. This is going from 600 to 7K. And this is going from 1.5K up to, what is that, 16K, 18K? So that's just a type of EQ. It's really not all that different than this. It just, it's more of a broad type of EQ. This is what the knobs are on those old consoles, the recording consoles, like in the PDF. So there are some, let's see if this will open up here. Here's another EQ, which is a classic, but this is just big moves. So here I can boost or attenuate, cut a certain low frequency. So I can say 100, boost that. And then for the high frequencies, 8, that's 8K. So I'm set it to 8K, boost or cut. And then the bandwidth is how wide that spectrum is. So these are just different tools. And it's good to know what each of them do. Most EQs, they have a different sound to them. So you might use something that is like this, a more broad sound, because of the tonal impact that it might have, addition to just like the surgical. Um, and then this is called a graphic EQ. So it's basically, it's showing you, this is 31 hertz all the way up to 16K, and then you can add or subtract the gain at that specific frequency. And that's how that type of EQ functions. Okay. So that's more or less the very quick and dirty EQ. Uh, so compression. Compression is going to be a hard one to explain over Zoom in terms of the audio examples, because the idea behind compression is that some things during a performance, they might go from very quiet to very loud to very quiet to very loud. And if you want to turn up the very quiets, the very louds are going to be way too loud. So compressors their goal is to make the loud things quieter, um, in a roundabout sort of way. I've always said it's compression is kind of like jumping on a bed. So let's say you're jumping on a bed, um, and I'm afraid you're gonna hurt yourself. So I'm gonna throw a sheet over you, and hopefully that means you can't jump as high. And that's more or less what a compressor is doing. And then I can determine how many sheets or how heavy they are to kind of reduce how high you're able to go. So, um, the stock logic compressor, um, it has a lot of knobs and a lot of buttons, and it can be pretty confusing. Um, the way that any um, digital streaming, especially for like Zoom, the way it works for our audio is it is compressing things to make sure that it's not using up too much space, or it doesn't, the file sizes aren't too big. So the audio that you're getting from me right now, unfortunately, is already being compressed quite a bit just from Zoom. Uh, so hopefully this translates. But the very basic idea here, and I'll pull up the trusty PDF here, um, is these are the controls of a compressor. I'm going to switch uh, the view here. So if I pull this up, threshold is at what point does this compressor start to activate, right? So let's say I'm singing and I'm going to have like some whispery parts, and then I start screaming like I was at the Bears game, and then I go back to whispery parts. Um, that would be really hard to make sound good in here because the difference in volume. So the idea here is you set a point. In this case, it's a threshold, and you can see that on this, there's this graph here that's moving. That threshold is where that compressor starts to kick in. So if I turn it way down, you're going to see here on the graph that it is, that white line's going way lower. Get rid of it, way louder. So I'm going to set this at a place that we can see some compression happening, right? So the threshold is like, I don't want you to jump on the bed and hurt yourself. The ratio is how many blankets I'm throwing over you to make sure that you can't get too high. So basically, this is all measured in decibels. Um, so right now, this ratio is 1 to 1, meaning for every 1 decibel over that initial threshold, it's only going to compress it 1 decibel. So just a tiny bit, if at all. Yeah, not really. So now if I start throwing more sheets on you, you can see now it's 2 to 1. So for every 1 decibel over that set threshold, that ratio is starting to bring it down. So 2 decibels for every 1 decibel over. And it can keep going up. 5 decibels, 12. And the more I turn it up, hopefully, the more it's going to compress. But if it's not compressing enough, I can always change my threshold to be lower. And then it'll really start to kick in. So now, I'm sure you've noticed, way quieter. If I turn it off, way louder, way quieter. So a lot of times compressors will have something called makeup gain. So if I just lost 5 decibels of volume, I could add it back. So that way the level is the same as it was when I started. It's just compressed now. So we're doing a good job in terms of compressing this. It sounds pretty good. So what I'm going to do here is change this up a little bit. Now we have attack and release. So the idea behind the attack is, when do you want the compression to start? If I set it really fast, we're going to measure it in milliseconds. That's what the MS is. It's going to compress immediately. So like when that snare drum hits, there's no compression or there's no transient. There's no spike of the stick hitting the drum head, because the attack, that basically, it's set to 0 milliseconds. It's saying that compressor will not let that spike through. So it sounds pretty almost dull right off the bat. But if I roll this up, now I can start to hear the impact a little bit more. So the idea behind that attack is it can let some of that initial transient through, so it still has the impact that you might want. The release is the same concept. It's how long is that compression going to be on there for? So if I turn this all the way up to 5,000 milliseconds, what you're going to see on the graph is that it's really slow to let go. Right? It's never really getting back up. But if I pull this all the way fast, now it's getting all the way back up. So we call this gain reduction. Right there. What that is the amount of gain, or essentially the volume that's being reduced by the compressor. So in this case, for a drum kit, I might do a really fast release, but a really slow attack. Yeah. Okay. It's a little more controlled. And that's going to be to taste. And again, like this, what I'm doing here is not specifically to make those drums sound good. It's just to be an example of what compression is doing. So auto gain or auto attack and release are not tools that I personally use, but it's basically letting the software handle it for you. In Logic, this thing has a limiter built in, and the limiter is kind of like instead of when you're jumping on the bed, instead of me throwing a blanket over you, I just have a huge piece of plywood, and you hit that, and you're not going through it. Limiters have their place for things that are a little too dynamically chaotic. So if you need to just control something to make sure that it can't possibly go over that volume point, a limiter has its place. So that's like the very basic functionality of what a compressor does. Um, in the PDF here are some visuals in terms of how it functions, as well as just a real generic uh, starting place. More often than not, when you find stuff online that is referencing, like, here's the magic frequency for a EQ, or here are the magic settings for a compressor for whatever the thing is, chances are it's not going to work. Same thing with presets. Most things in Logic or Pro Tools or whatever will have presets. You could start there, but you will likely have to tweak it to kind of fit your specific recording. Um, Additionally, there are different types of compressors, and these compressors all have their own sonic character. So Logic is pretty cool. It includes a series of different types in their primary compressor plugin. They all have their own little sonic changes. So you might use one over another. Um, and honestly, like, all of the different types of compressors are probably best served for another conversation. Um, but read up, look on YouTube, hear what the difference is between a VCA compressor, a FET compressor, an optical compressor, or a tube compressor. Um, they're all very, very valuable. There's also this guy here, which is a multi-band compressor, which is essentially, I don't have to use the PDF. I can just open it up. Uh-huh. Basically, a multi-band compressor is a compressor that works like an EQ. So what I can do is I can set these different ranges. Here, I'll put this on the drums. Make sure that we're stereo. Okay. And basically what this is doing is, if I want to compress the low end differently than how I might compress, I am compressing this low end differently than I'm compressing mid. Now I compress the mid range down way differently. I can turn up the attack and release. You can see that these bands of the EQ spectrum, from 20 hertz all the way up to 20 hertz, they are being treated differently. That absolutely has its place. And you definitely see it in mastering, which is something we're not going to talk about today. But multi-band compression is a very, very valuable tool. Having said that, there is the exact opposite as well, which is compression built into EQ. So here I can have Q, and it's essentially doing the same thing, but this is just built into an EQ. You'd call this a dynamic EQ. So I've found this EQ spectrum, and it is now essentially reducing when that frequency is being built up. And I can do the same thing to boost it if I needed. Yeah, just more tools that you can use to kind of help carve your sounds. Okay, we'll keep rolling here. Clipping. So there's two types of clipping. There's the really bad clipping, which is when you've turned your interface up way too high, and it's distorting. But clipping in mixing can actually be kind of cool. Essentially, instead of like limiting or compressing, what it's doing is it's essentially just like lopping off the top of a waveform, and that can help it essentially uh, cut through a little differently. It won't be as dynamic, but it helps it find its space in the overall collection of sounds. Next up, noise gate. This is another dynamic. And the idea behind a noise gate is that it basically is reducing the sound of something. Like right here, this is our kick drum. You can kind of hear the snare drum in the background. But when I have this on, what it's doing is it's cutting out all of the sound I don't want. So I can adjust the threshold just like a compressor, and it will basically be muted unless something goes over that threshold point. So I use that a lot on drums. Okay, back to our trusty PDF. So that kind of explains the concept of a noise gate. Saturation. Saturation is kind of like good distortion. And this brings up a concept in physics uh, where you might have a fundamental tone. So right here, you can see there's a fundamental frequency. And the idea behind saturation is when you saturate something, it pulls out first, second, and third order harmonics, and then all of their octaves until they kind of fade away. So this is a great example, this image here of what saturation does. And compressors can saturate, hardware equipment can saturate. Tape famously saturates. That's why people still record on tape and not just digital, because the idea is, you know, it makes things harmonically more exciting. So instead of it just being a really clean capture of something, that can sound sterile. So those earliest digital recordings sound pretty bad comparatively to the what was before it when people were recording to tape and they couldn't figure out what it was. They're missing all of that harmonic saturation. And these days we have plugins that kind of emulate what tape looks like. So this looks like a tape machine. It's even spinning. And it kind of, if I put that on a drum kit, it can make it sound like there's a little more coloration, some real pleasant stuff that can happen. Other tools, reverb. This can essentially make it sound like you're in a space that you're not in otherwise. So here, actually, no, let's do that here. This is a fun plugin that makes it sound like you're in a room that you're not in. So here, I can pull this up and it's going to sound like I'm in the chamber of Sunset Sound Studios. I can change how long that reverb tail lasts. Okay, sounds pretty good. So each of these are different types of reverbs. And it just changes the character. That's a killer sounding plugin. I love that one. Okay, so that goes into delays. Reverbs and delays are things I'm going to use on vocals a lot. It kind of makes it sound a little more majestic. And I like, you probably don't need me to explain all of the functions or the controls of a delay, but they're on there if you need more explanation. Modulation. Modulation is something that takes the waveform and makes it sound like it's moving a little bit. So here we're going to listen to these drums, hopefully. Oh. And if I put some chorus on, you can hear it kind of like spinning. That's definitely 80s. You can feel the 80s radiating out of that. Okay, next up, widening. Sometimes you need things to sound like they are bigger than they are or wider than they are. So this might be loading up slowly. So the idea here is that it's going to take a stereo signal that feels like it's here when you're listening to it. And what it can do is it can mess with the waveform shapes. So in theory, if we're listening, the waveforms coming out of the speakers that get to our ears, you can kind of mess with when one arrives versus the other. And by doing that, you can make something feel like it's starting to go from here to here. So here's the drum. Now it feels way wider, but it feels a little goofy. So that's something that I use. I wouldn't use that like on a full drum kit, but I might use something that's a stereo widener, like on a keyboard or background vocals, just to make it feel like it's a little wider sounding than it might be otherwise. Okay. So, um, there are a lot of other kind of like useful tools like pitch and effects. This thing will change the sound. You can sound like a robot or uh, that is not necessarily something that you're going to want to do, but it does have its place. So there are a lot of tools that get kind of like controlled chaos in a fun way that you might use to introduce uh, some otherworldly sounds to your recording. Um, there are a lot of modern safety nets. So a drum replacement tool. So basically, the idea here is, um, which one is this? Okay, I can essentially take a snare drum and make it sound like someone else's snare drum. So original, and then samples, and I can make it sound like it's in some other room. Basically, at some point, someone had recorded this drum sample, and if I get like a really bad sounding drum that is kind of unsalvageable, sometimes I might use something like this to kind of help support it, to make it sound hopefully more like a real drum. Sometimes bad things happen when recording on an otherwise like good performance or good take. Maybe a microphone fell over or something. And this is a tool that can help save you. Um, There are pitch correction things. Yes, there's auto tune that um, as an effect, like T-Pain, but you can also essentially kind of like use it in a more subtle way. So if someone had a really good performance, but a note might just be a little low or high, what you can do is you can kind of see here on the left, it's like a piano, and you just kind of like nudge the note into correct pitch. Uh, Try not to do that, but it's nice to know that you have it. There are also a lot of like virtual amps. If you are recording and you have like your guitar plugged directly into your interface, you're just recording the raw guitar. You can usually find a pretty good amp sim or amp simulator that can have effects. It could be modeled after a different type of amp. Um, this is a great way to kind of like add some depth to your mixes to kind of like make your guitar sound cooler. Um, Phase correction, basically, the concept of phase is that if you have some really anything that you're recording, if you're recording it with two microphones, um, so we'll take a snare drum because that's probably the most obvious. Snare drum, you're going to hit the drum. And when you hit the drum, you are creating like an airtable. That's the technical term, right? It's the waveforms that are going in the different directions. So usually you're going to put a microphone like right on the snare drum, aimed at the top of it. When you hit it, the airtable, the sound wave is going from the drum up into the microphone. But a lot of times when I record a snare drum, I've also got a microphone aimed at the bottom of the snare drum because that's where the wires are, and it sounds more like a snare drum that way. And when I hit the drum, that airtable is moving down towards that microphone. So you basically have these sound waves, one's going up and one's going down. And what happens is if you think of what a waveform looks like, you know, up, down, up, down. Well, the one of them will be going up and down. The other is going to be inverted, going down and up. So you'll see that as what's referred to as phase. Um, Technically, it's polarity, and most mic preamps will have the opportunity, or like a button or a switch that allows you to kind of select, do you want your waveform for this thing to go up or down? Um, and sometimes your recording might be out of phase unintentionally. Like if you have someone singing guitar or singing a song and playing guitar at the same time, if you're using two microphones, there's no assurance that the waveform will be going like a positive waveform going into both of those individual microphones. And what happens when one's going up and one's going down, it essentially cancels out sound. It is wild. It can sound like frequencies on your EQ have just totally vanished. They've disappeared. So there are these phase correction tools that can help bring it back. Um, so next up, this is balance. Goes back to the volumes we are talking about. Um, so first things first, uh, you have left, center, right, and the spectrum that occurs there. Um, both of these graphics are great. They're showing you, this top one here is showing you roughly the EQ range of these instruments and a good starting place to where you would try to place them in the panning spectrum, left to right. Um, and this does a pretty good job, but this isn't really necessarily referencing volumes as much. So I do like the circles here because they're kind of giving you a sense of like where things might live in terms of the size of them. Um, so when you hear people talking about balancing a mix, it is specifically about the volume of each component as well as where it sits in the stereo spectrum, the stereo field, as well as the EQ relationships to each other. So this is a good starting place to try to figure out roughly where things are going to go. This top one has rhythm guitar in the center. I don't love that. My center of most of my mixes is vocals, snare, bass drum, and bass guitar. Um, when you're mixing drums, there's usually two concepts that people will kind of pick between. Drummer perspective. So if you've ever sat behind a drum kit, hi-hats to your left, snare drums kind of center, kick drums center, toms are kind of around you, and you might have your ride cymbal to your right. That's drummer's perspective, and that's usually how I will kind of pan things. So in my drums here, so all my yellow guys are drums. So I might put my rack tom over here a little bit, and then I might put my floor tom to the left and my hi-hat to the right. And then my overheads are going to be left and right, and I might go further out. And now, when I listen to these drums, I want to hear the toms go around me, and everything kind of sits in its own space. And then when I start panning in guitars or vocals, I'm probably not going to put them in the same space that I've put these things. So everybody kind of lives in their own space along that spectrum. It just helps everything kind of have a little bit of separation. Um, most digital uh, recording software has something called automation. And automation is the idea that as it plays through, the software itself can do things like in this PDF here, the yellow guy's volume. So it's showing that this vocal one here, the volume is going from, -9 up to +3.5, and then down again. Uh, or if you want something to go from, left ear to right ear or back and forth, that's what this green panning is. It's showing that it's kind of starting center and going all the way to the right and then going all the way to the left. And basically, as the song plays through, automation is literally automating how that works. You'll see the panning knob move on its own or the volume knob. Um, the most complex part of mixing is probably your signal flow. And in this case, very loosely, the idea is that when you have all of these individual pieces, all of them flow to your main stereo output, like your stereo left, right for your headphones, or if you have two speakers, I've got a couple of speakers in here. Everything goes to that, and it's usually just one stereo output, but it doesn't have to. So what I like to do is I like to put everything in their own little box. So like right here, all my drums, I could set their output to stereo output, and that would just send them right to the thing the fader I just moved. But I don't. You can see they all say bus 3. And without getting too deep into the world of buses, it's basically allowing you to kind of like dump everything into one fader. So all my drums here, instead of all going to the stereo output, this guy here. So now if I want to turn all my drums down at once, I have one fader to do so. And that's a use case for what buses are. Um, so here, this is saying that on average, you might see multiple channels just go straight to your stereo bus or your master output. Uh, but what I'm doing is something like this, where my channels are going into one just general group and then to the master bus. Um, so um, similar to this, where like basically it's just taking multiple channels and sending them to one individual thing. Um, it can get as convoluted as you need it to. And I tried to put some examples in here, but when you are just starting, you probably don't need to do any of those types of routing. But I know we're running out of time, but just as an example here, this is a song by uh, a group that I work with called Spare Animals.
When your logic fails.
There are some vocals, and you can see that there's a ton of vocals on here. What I can do is if I want to put reverb on the vocals, instead of putting one reverb on every vocal, because that would be a lot, I can go over here. In Logic, this is where it is. You can see here on the left, it says sends. I can go down here. I'll just grab bus 20. I'll call it bus 20. It just popped up. There it is. These little guys are little circles are essentially knobs. So right now they're all off. I'm going to turn them all on. So
When your logic fails.
no change yet because my reverb, I'm going to call this reverb. I'm going to take that reverb I liked from before, this guy, and I'm going to go to chamber because I want to add some reverb. This vocal is too dry.
When your logic fails, trust yourself and that data does not compute.
So what's going
And
to happen?
IDIC,
When I turn this on,
IDIC, IDIC.
it sounds like they're in a space that they're not in. And the idea here is that, like I said, instead of putting one reverb on, 10 vocal tracks, I can just add this bus and put the reverb on the bus, and then I can turn up however much volume or much reverb I want on those individual tracks by turning their individual bus volume up or down. And that's usually how I add effects. Again, that bus routing is very, very convoluted, and I'm encouraging Nate that we should do another one of these to talk about how that signal flow works. So a couple things here. I put my website on there just in case anyone needs it. And then this is a killer link to anyone who's learning Logic. The website is called Why Logic Pro Rules. And this particular thing is a playlist. It's like 60 videos long where he goes from like, this is how you download Logic off the App Store through really complex Logic usage. It's a great, and I encourage all of my students to use it who are using Logic. It is a wonderful resource. Uh, so that's about it. That's the very basics of the concepts and tools that we use in mixing. And I'm ready for some questions, Nate. If lay them on me.
Yeah, you went through a ton, Greg. So yeah, I definitely think some additional classes might be in order. But let's go through some questions here. So, um, one question that came in early on was when you're starting a mix, do you usually start with EQ or compression?
Um, that is a great question. It is really source dependent. Um, you know, I think that a good place to start can be subtractive EQ, where you are trying to carve out things that might be a problem. Um, But if, a snare drum is really unruly in terms of the dynamics between quiet and loud, you might have to address that first. Because if you put the EQ on there and you start to pull out those resonant frequencies on that snare drum, and then you put the compressor on to fix the dynamic volume, it might be pulling back those EQ moves you just made because it's raised the volume up. So it's a real delicate balance in terms of trying to figure out the order in which a specific thing might need to be addressed.
Right.
Hopefully that helps.
Also to yeah, yeah. To the attendees, if you have any further questions, feel free to throw them in the Q&A. And as long as Greg is willing to stick around, we'll try to get as many as we can through. There was a question also early on about low end sound. I think just a clarification, like when you're talking about it, are you also talking about like rumble sounds, not necessarily just the bass guitar, but like when you're doing that high pass filter, is that addressing rumbling as well?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, you know, I, that's part of the noise floor. Basically, anything that isn't left hand on a piano, bass guitar, kick drum, or some like low end, uh, like synthesizers, like EDM. I'm cutting out a lot of that low end stuff because all of those frequencies slowly but surely build up. So like the last thing we talked about is that signal flow of like all the channels are essentially like they all compile at the end to that one stereo bus, stereo fader. Um, so all of the like let's say, it's a singer. Most singers don't produce much usable sound under like 200 hertz. Anything that that microphone is picking up under that frequency, uh, it's still impacting like the compressor that you might be using. Even if you're not hearing it or feeling it, it's still signal that exists there. So if you carve some of that stuff out, you can really clean up the general starting place for any mix.
Cool. A question about vocals. So when you're EQing vocals, what's actually changing, and why does a recorded vocal sound so different from singing live on a stage?
Oh man, that's
This is a whole
complex.
class in itself, huh?
Yeah, yeah. So live on a stage, the sound guy, who unfortunately I've also been the sound guy here, um, you are dealing with not just the singer, but all of the other instruments or sounds that are occurring on stage. So, uh, a singer, their voice might need brightness on stage. Like it's like they might have a dull sounding voice or are using a microphone that isn't suitable for their voice. And you want to turn up that top end EQ. But when the drummer hits the cymbals, it's piercing because the microphone is hearing that. So live, you are dealing with the dance of trying to make the singer sound good without, bringing in all of the other instrumentation that exists on stage. Um, So in terms of what's happening for EQing or um you know, like in a recorded scenario, uh you have the opportunity to be way more surgical. So you know, Taylor Swift, her vocal chain, meaning the microphone, the mic preamp, the EQ and the compressor that are all part of that's in between Taylor Swift and the computer she's recording into. That's like 50 grand or more. It's all very, very nice stuff. So all of that is suited specifically for her tone of voice, which helps whomever is recording it or mixing it to just be able to dial it in with relative ease, and it's going to sound significantly better than what we're probably using at home.
Hmm.
Hopefully that helps.
Question, I think this was when you were talking about compression, and maybe you did address it later, but there's a question of why doesn't compression bring down the quiet parts? You talked about it bringing down the loud parts, but why isn't it also bringing down the quiet parts? And
Because
what's
you are
different about
set,
compression?
yeah, you're setting the threshold, and whatever occurs below the threshold, it's not touched by the compression. It's when the audio path or the audio signal goes over that, that's when the compression circuit starts to activate and address it. So anything below it, uh, that's essentially how it works. There is something that is called upwards compression, which is basically taking the quiet things and trying to bring them up to a threshold, but you don't see that very often.
Question here, should you generally record tracks without effects and then add them during the mix or use them on the source track?
Um, that's up to the artist. Um, I will say that, a lot of times I'm mixing music that I didn't get to record. People all over the world have sent me songs to kind of mix on their or to try and help them, make it sound good. And um, what I always say is like whatever you can do to make it sound right to your ears before it comes to me, that's making both our lives better. A lot of times these days you'll see people like, fix it in post. If something sounds bad, just fix it later. Uh, no, fix it in pre. Fix it before it goes to whatever the final stages are. Um, so like if there's like a reverb that you really like, you can include it. You can actually set your recording software using the buses to essentially um you can record the reverb tail of your vocals and have that on its own track. So that way a guy like me can determine like, okay, I know roughly what reverb that uh the rough reverb sounds that they want. And it just makes it a lot easier. So if there's like a room sound or a reverb or a delay or anything like that, absolutely, commit to it early.
Cool. I can answer this one. Is the PDF available? Sorry, I was a little late. Yes, just to reiterate, this PDF is available. Greg dropped it in the chat, but I will also be sending it out tomorrow in my follow-up email. So along with the recording of this presentation. Question here about live recording. What kind of strategies can you use in a live recording to minimize mic bleed? So, and also if you could talk about what is mic bleed for those who don't know.
Yeah. So I kind of talked about it with the live or the vocal uh or like running sound for vocals earlier. Mic bleed is that when you have a microphone on a source and it's picking up other sounds. So, when a singer is performing, chances are her the performing vocal mic is hearing all of the other instruments as well. Uh, and especially if you try to use compression live, that's usually bringing everything and making everything louder. So it might make the bleed sound more pronounced. Um, so it's really, for live recording, that is all about the mic choice in terms of like what if you're going to use a cardioid or probably not an omni mic, but the different types of polar patterns on mics, uh, basically it impacts the directionality of it. So you might be able to use a microphone and angle it in a way that reduces the amount of bleed that's getting into that mic. Um, but it's mic placement, it's how spread out can you be? Um, if like, for drums, if the drummer really likes all the drums like close and they play like this, it's really hard to get isolated individual pieces. But if they play with with all the drums a little wider, you might have a little more room to position a microphone so that way it's not picking up everything else as loud.
That could probably be a whole class in itself as well, just tracking.
Oh yeah, that's
Yeah.
the most important part.
Hmm. Um, okay. I'm just going to read this. I'm not exactly sure what. So on the EQ graph, what does each control point represent, and how should we think about moving them intentionally rather than just by ear?
Um, okay, so I'm assuming that that's referring to the frequency spectrum of the
Yeah.
EQ. So let me do this. I'll solo up the drums. Uh, Unfortunately, uh, there is no hard and fast rule that will work for any one source. Um, you really have to do it by ear. When you think about Beatles or Led Zeppelin, um, they didn't have a visual. All they could do is try to, manipulate their EQ knobs to kind of create the sound that they're looking for. Um, so there isn't, like I said, there's not a hard and fast rule. And like I talked about it, in probably the first 5 minutes, is that what we're trying to do is essentially shape puzzle pieces. So I could make the drums sound a certain way, like maybe right here, listening to those drums, it's exactly what I want. It is the perfect drum sound. Uh, that might not work with the rest of the song. The other instrumentation also needs to exist in there. So, when you are using an EQ, you want to make sure that you are ideally not doing much in solo, which I am here. Because when you hear it all in context, maybe this doesn't work anymore. So the goal is to kind of use EQ to help shape your puzzle pieces of drums, bass, keys, guitars, vocals to get them all to kind of work together. So unfortunately, like I said, there's the EQ graph of roughly what instruments live where on the EQ frequency spectrum. But beyond that, there aren't very specific hard and fast rules outside of um, just make sure that the EQ choices you're making, whether it's additive or subtractive, works in conjunction with the rest of your tracks.
Thanks. All right. Dustin asks, let's say hypothetically, I have a recording where I've added some saturation to the drums, and then
Mm-hmm.
it starts giving me some really unpleasant high frequencies. How would you recommend addressing the issue while keeping the saturation effect intact?
Yeah. Uh, so hypothetically, um, I would probably use automation with an EQ. So let's say as the song is playing, let's say the saturation is just increasing more and more. So it's, what did sound like drums just started to get more and more distorted until it was kind of like a really distorted, like almost chaotic sound. Uh, like we talked about with saturation before, saturation increases the harmonics of different frequencies. So if you are really saturating, it could create way more frequencies that weren't really there before, and it might increase their volume significantly. Um, so what I might do is automate an EQ that might start flat, and then as the saturation increases, the EQ might kind of start to tame some of that top end or the brightness that is essentially being multiplied. As the saturation is increasing, it's multiplying how loud all of that stuff is. So that's a good use case for how someone might use automation to kind of
Hmm.
like maintain a consistent sound. This wouldn't make it sound any less distorted, but let's say as the saturation increases, and it might end up adding like 5, 10 dB decibels of top end that weren't there earlier. So if you just balance it like this, where it's slowly decreasing as the saturation's increasing, it should hopefully be relatively even, uh, or at least more controlled.
Um, Someone saying great job all the way around. Good job with the sound through Zoom. So thanks a lot, Greg. Um, how about this? When you record vocals in one song that are extremely different styles, such as a soft whisper, pop-like, operatic, belting, should you record them on different tracks so that you can have more control when mixing, or is there a reason to keep them on one track?
Um, the reason to keep them on one track would be that you're trying to capture the raw emotion of a performance. Um, like that to me is at least worth exploring. Whether or not that it is a functional thing for the sound for your mix, that's a whole other question. But at the very least, like I do think that there is something to the idea of a performance being captured. Um, Having said that, maybe that's a total train wreck and it doesn't work. Um, so what you can do is something like this. Let's say that this vocal is really loud, right? And we'll pretend like this was a screamy part and here's a more normal part. Um, there are tools. So up here in the top left in Logic, uh, there is a gain tool. And what I can do is I can try to bring down the waveform gain. And a lot of times I'll do that where I will try to like get stuff roughly in the ballpark of about the same. So that way you don't necessarily hear a compressor kicking in or changing the texture of what a vocal will sound like. So a lot of times prior to mixing, I have a whole editing sequence that I'll go through to make sure that the vocal levels are in the ballpark.
Cool. All right, let's just do two more questions so that we can kind of wrap this up here. I've got a question that says, I record and mix in the same room, and it is a concrete box essentially. Is
Yeah.
my recording pretty much doomed, or are there any dynamics that help compensate for an untreated room? Um, I'm assuming it's completely dependent on the vocal, but any general tips?
Um, Yeah. Uh, First tip, if you're around here, North Central Acoustic Solutions is great. They make acoustic panels like these for really affordable price. They're about $50 a panel. Even a couple of them can make all the difference in the world. You can create like a little two-panel vocal booth. You can put them up for behind you for mixing. Um, this is essentially a concrete cube, and I just put up panels everywhere I could, and it really has made a significant impact. Um, if you use headphones to mix, that reduces the impact of the room. Um, there are tools that you can use for your listening environment that essentially it's software that you install as like a plugin, and then you basically walk around with like a microphone in your room and it plays like sonar sounds. And what it does is it takes a EQ readout of your room and then essentially applies the inverse EQ to your like your main output. So that way, when you're listening back through your speakers, hopefully it's relatively flat and that's a good tool. But I would just get some panels. I think that's probably the most because they work for both tracking and recording.
I'll also do one little plug though, if it's just like a vocal you need to do. You feel free to book the studio here. We do have a 5x7 isolation booth, so do some of your trekking at home, and then you can do some at the library if you need to.
Shameless plug.
All right, here's the last question we'll do for the evening,
Okay.
and it's essentially a question about DAWs. Can you just explain why you have chosen to go with Logic, and um, what maybe what led you to Logic, what you like about it?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Um, I ultimately I use three, or like three primary ones. Logic is the one I use the most. Um, all DAWs, all recording softwares do the same exact thing. Um, it's just a different language. Um, and so when I started, Pro Tools was like the thing. Um, and I mean, it still is. It's the main one that you're going to find in most recording studios. Um, but early on, Pro Tools required you to buy their hardware. Um, and their hardware was not cheap. And additionally, when you bought their hardware, unless you bought like the most expensive, like, $5,000 plus hardware, um, they would give you like a limited version of Pro Tools. Like you get 16 tracks and 8 buses, um, which seemed ridiculous. I always thought that was like a shady practice. And in the early 2000s, Logic or Apple computers bought Logic from its old company and rebuilt it as their own. And it's essentially a loss leader. You can only use Logic on Apple systems. But their idea was that if they made competitive recording software, people would be more inclined to buy their hardware computers. And over the years, Logic has absolutely caught up to Pro Tools in terms of like a lot of the functionality. Um, but more than anything, Logic is probably the most affordable. It's $199. And just today they announced that there is going to be a subscription option, but you don't have to subscribe specifically, thank God. Um, but for $199, you have recording software that is supported by the most wealthy company in the history of the world. And basically, they just keep throwing new functions into it for free upgrades. Uh, no other DAW does that. So basically, Logic is a great recording system, but it has a great sample library if you want to use samples or loops. It has its own function that essentially operates like Ableton, like where you can use a grid if you want to do Ableton style EDM music. It has its own built-in drum software, so you wouldn't have to go purchase like Easy Drummer or something like that. It has built-in pitch correction, so you don't have to go buy like Melodyne or Auto Tune. The plugin suite that's included with it is remarkable. It really for $199, it has everything that you could possibly want. Um, Pro Tools is still like the cheapest one they make is 250 bucks, and they'll support it for a year. So if updates come out next year, uh you'd be fine if you bought it today. But if updates come out in 2 years, sorry, you got to buy it again. Uh I just don't love their business practices. Um, Reaper is another option, and I use that from time to time. And it is essentially, it's probably the most affordable um, of the DAWs. More or less free. And if at some point during the time in which you use it, you feel like throwing them 50 bucks, they'll take it, but I don't think you have to. Um, so like it's a great way to get started. It works on Windows and PC. Um, it just has a very limited collection of tools like compressors or EQs or whatever that are included with it. It's not to say that you can't add more. You absolutely can. You can buy a plugin that does any function you could imagine. Um, but it's just out of the box. It's more rudimentary.
All right. Well, I'm going to cut it off there. And I just want to thank you especially for your generous time and especially
Sure.
for answering all these questions and everything and all the broad knowledge. And again, we will send all the supplementary stuff out tomorrow. And I just want to thank all of you here who are still here for attending this evening and supporting both, audio mixing and the library.
Hey, thanks for hosting this, bud.